All right. Well, I guess we can get started. Colby, you are aware that I am currently working on a big video talking about sort of like the current climate of like video game remakes and things like that. For those listening right now, this is going to be kind of like a separate video, but I'm going to be using chunks of this video and the big video. But for those listening, Colby, you are an acquaintance of mine. Hello, how's it going?
Hello, Jimmy. I'm good. How are you?
I'm fantastic now that I'm talking to
Good.
you.
It is fantastic to be talking to you, too.
Thank you. So I went to you because I knew that you are a Resident Evil fan. Me and you have had many a conversation about Resident Evil. You're a lot more familiar with it than I am. I played a little bit of like 2, like we played 2 together, which was adorable. It was very kind.
It was very kawaii.
Yeah, you were helping me along the way because they're a very different kind of game than like I would say like a modern like shooter or have you. So Colby, I wanted to ask you just to start it off, like, what do you think of because Resident Evil 4 is going to get remade. But before we get talking about the remake, what are your opinions on Resident Evil 4, like the original?
Resident Evil 4 is a great game.
Mm-hmm.
The best part of Resident Evil 4 is the inventory system.
Okay.
The managing your attaché case is phenomenal and is worthy of a game all on its own. But all jokes aside, RE4, it's considered one of the best games of its generation and or of all time, and it's very deserved. I played it for the first time probably in 2012 or so it was definitely after it had been out for quite a few years, and I think it might have already gotten an HD re-release at that point, but I played the original on the GameCube.
Okay.
But the game's phenomenal, and it really helped get me into more horror games, really.
Okay.
Because before that, I hadn't played nearly as many horror games. But it really, I think it's one of the best early examples of a well put together over-the-shoulder third-person shooter. I think a lot of games after it really took a lot of cues from that game.
I've heard it described as like the first like over-the-shoulder shooter. Is that correct?
I would say it's correct.
Yeah.
I would say it's bare minimum because there's always going to be somebody in the comments that points out something was released a week before RE4 was.
Yeah.
But I would say at bare minimum, it was the first, widely successful mainstream third-person shooter. I would absolutely say that, and it really made a blueprint for a lot of other developers to follow. I do have a weird sort of relationship with RE4 that I think some other Resident Evil fans do, where that game is both the sort of height of that era of the franchise, but as a result, it is the beginning of the decline of the franchise.
Okay.
Because that is what really pivoted the game in a more action-oriented direction.
Right.
And that is often considered to be, and I would agree, is considered to be the part of what is not good about RE5 and 6.
Okay.
Was the further leaning into action that started with RE4.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I know 5 is where people started seeing the decline. But 4 was like the first one. I definitely remember when 4 came out because weirdly enough, I had a PS2 and my dad randomly bought it. And I was like, oh, is this for me? And he was like, no, this is for me. And I was like, okay, like my PS2 isn't here. He was like, yeah, can you bring it over? And I was like, okay. I don't know how much of it he played, if at all, but I was just like, okay, I definitely remember it coming out though, and obviously I know the big cultural impact that the game had. Our mutual friend Dave, I know, is a big fan of that, a huge fan of the Resident Evil games just in general. But yeah, I'm definitely. It is definitely weird how this game, because like I guess my next question would be like, do you think Resident Evil 4 holds up? Like at the original game, do you think like you can just go back and play it now and it seems like I wouldn't say a modern game, but a game that you can kind of go back to and look at fondly?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I think functionally, you know, that game functions, you know, just about as well as a lot of other modern third-person shooters do. Obviously, the biggest difference in RE4 is that you can't walk and shoot at the same time.
Oh, okay.
And that is sort of what still holds its roots in the original games, you know, survival horror
Right.
roots. Because really, in a lot of ways, the control scheme is exactly the same as the old games, but the camera angle is fixed over your shoulder instead of, you know, fixed angles wherever they are. Which is part of why when people say, I can't play a game with tank controls, you know, and I say, have you played RE4? I say, well, you kind of already have. It's just that the orientation of the camera is different.
Right.
But I think, especially, I mean, you know, knowing that you and I were going to chat about this, I booted up, you know, just the PC release of RE4. It looks great. I mean, that game with just, you know, running at 1080p and, you know, I know that there have been a lot of fan texture packs and stuff. I mean, you put some nice textures in that thing, and I mean, it looks phenomenal, you know? Right. Obviously, you know, if you're playing the stock game, you know, that's kind of because you and I have played a lot of varying degrees of HD remasters versus remakes versus you know, just ports.
Right.
It's great to see a game run at a higher resolution, but sometimes it shows you how old the game is because you know, you see how blurry a lot of the textures are that you know, you didn't notice before with the lower resolution. But you know, RE4, I mean, a lot of the character models still look very good. You know, the animations still look good. It runs very well, you know, on all 11,000 re-releases it's had.
Yes. yes.
You know, but yeah, absolutely. I think it's a game that's very easy in its current state that you could just go back and play and still have a very good time with.
Right. And like to your point of like the 1,000 re-releases, like this game is literally on like every system, like you name it, it's going to be on it. It's on the Switch, it's on PlayStation 4, it's on PlayStation 5, it's on Xbox, it's on Xbox 360, like GameCube, Wii, like this game has been re-released to no end. VR, yes, correct. It's on the Oculus. I actually have an Oculus back there. You can play it literally on like a TI-84 at this point. Like it is very interesting that it is so re-released and they're making this remake. It is very interesting because you say like as I'm not going to call you a Resident Evil expert, but you're definitely more of an expert than I am. But like, I'm sure to a lot of Resident Evil fans, like this game is definitely replayable. You can go back to it and like you can actually go back and play it. Like unlike somebody like Nintendo, Capcom does like to re-release their games and usually for like a decent price too. Like you don't have to pay like $60 for Resident Evil 4, although with this remake, I'm sure you're going to have to. What do you think? So you also, like I said before, we played the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. And obviously RE4, this remake, is probably going to be in a similar vein of RE2 and RE3. What do you think the elements are that they're going to be taking from those games and they're going to use them for like a remake?
So I think one of their big goals with these remakes is that they want to tonally unify the games. That is a trend I've noticed ever since RE7 Biohazard came out.
Right. And RE8 you can do third person now.
You can.
It is interesting that you bring that up because that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and you know, The biggest thing I noticed when RE7 came out was how much more serious it was from other Resident Evil games, because the Resident Evil games are goofy. I mean, there's no other way around it. I mean, they are silly games when you really get down to what they are.
From the first one, there's that zombie talking, like the written note from the zombie saying like, "Oh, I want brains." And
itchy
stuff
tasty.
like that. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, itchy tasty. And you have Barry going, for anyone not familiar with the scene, when you're playing Jill's campaign in RE1, there was a trap room where the ceiling starts to come down and the doors lock, and then one of the other characters walks up, outside, and he helps you get out and gets you just in the nick of time, because, of course.
Right.
And in the original RE1 on the PS1, he goes, "You are almost a Jill sandwich," and you can almost hear the voice actor like stifling his laughs as he delivers the line.
Right.
And they changed it in RE Remake, which again was a bit more serious than the original RE1. Instead, the line is, "Oh, that was close, Jill. You almost got turned into a sandwich," or something to that effect.
Right.
And so anyway, I think, with RE7 being as serious as it was, and playing RE2, and you've played a bit of RE2 Remake.
Yes.
How it's a serious game. There's not a lot of overt humor in the game. It's, really in a weird way, the only things that are funny is if you have the context of the rest of the franchise, and then going back and going, "Oh, look at Birkin's big goofy eyeball that he has as his weak spot." But that's not something that's inherently funny.
Right.
And that trend continued in RE3. And I think that's going to be a big change in RE4 Remake, and I think it might rustle some feathers of some fans, because RE4 is very campy. I mean,
really?
Leon is throwing out one-liners all over the place, and the villains at some points, they throw out one-liners like they're cartoon villains, and you suplex enemies, and when I say that, I mean it very literally. There is a prompt that comes up that says mash A to suplex, and then Leon does a big goofy suplex. I mean, it's, I would be shocked if a lot of those things remain in RE4 Remake, because I think they're using this opportunity to, okay, we're going to make all these games in the same engine, in the RE engine, which, fun fact, is the Reach engine. A lot of people think it's the Resident Evil engine, but it's the Reach engine.
Oh, okay.
I think they're going, we want to make all these games in the same engine, where they're going to have a very similar visual aesthetic. They're going to have a similar tonal aesthetic. We're going to finally, have some consistency with the voice actors, because those have changed over every release as the series has gone on. So I think, more than anything else, I think what they're going to pull from the other remakes they've done so far is they're going to pull the tone from those remakes.
Okay.
And just make it sort of fit, visually, aesthetically, every element, to make it more in line with what is now RE2, 3, will be 4, and then 7 and 8.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder how much they're going to mess with the controls too, because I've played a little bit of Resident Evil 4. I've dabbled in it, but it definitely feels a lot more different than what they've done so far with the RE2 and RE3 remakes. So I'm guessing they're probably going to unify them a little bit more with those and make them feel like they belong together.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So yeah, I mean, we get all this context about what they're probably going to do with this. And first of all, do you think they're going to continue with these and make 5 and 6 remakes after this?
That's a really interesting question, and I've been thinking about that a lot, especially after, it was, RE4 Remake was kind of an open secret until it finally got officially announced.
Right.
I'm not sure, because I wanted a remake of Code Veronica instead of RE4.
A lot of people have.
I was really clamoring for a CVX remake, because that game can really use a remake. And, I felt the same thing about RE3, where RE3 could have really used a remake because there was a very complicated development history with those two that I won't go on a tangent on now to get too off topic. Maybe if you feel like it later on, but I think that especially because taking those older games with the fixed cameras and tank controls is a big barrier for people.
For sure.
People when they want to go back and play games, and then they find whether it's the old Silent Hill games or the Resident Evil games, they see tank controls and they go, no, I don't want to touch it.
Right.
And they're not too difficult to adapt to if you take some time with them, but at the same time, I can understand if you're used to very fluid third-person or first-person controls, going back to tank controls from the late 90s is difficult.
Yes.
It's a difficult curve to get over at first. And, as far as if they're going to remake 5 and 6, I think they could. I could see them doing that. And then the interesting thing you run into at that point is where do you stop?
Right.
Because if you look out, let's say they, RE4 remake is going to come out, I think it's early next year in 2023 that it's going to come out. So you have RE3, or RE4 coming out then. Even if they don't do Code Veronica, let's say they do RE5 and 6.
Right.
RE5 will take several years. So you figure, if they leapfrog the development like they have with the past couple of remakes, let's say it comes out at some point in 2024.
Right.
And then they remake RE6, and that comes out at some point in 2026.
Yep.
Well, now you're 1 year away from 10 years of RE7.
Right.
So do you remake RE7 at that point?
Right.
And then
plus
where does
that
it
is
stop?
a first-person game too, so maybe they would want to do like a third-person over-the-shoulder kind of game. But yeah, that is interesting. Like 10 years, like I think that's long enough for a remake to get made for the PlayStation 7.
Yeah, you just roll over it because now they're already talking about remaking RE1.
Right.
And
right.
that's
I
think I think because at that point it'll be the only game you didn't remake from the other ones in the same style. So I think whether or not they're going to remake RE 5 and 6, I think that is very dependent on how Capcom sees these remakes. Like, is it true that a big part of them making these remakes is to create kind of a tonally consistent RE universe, right, of all these games?
Right.
If that's the case, then yeah, I could see them doing it, and people will buy them. Like, even though I wasn't clamoring for an RE4 remake, I'm gonna buy it because I've bought RE4 4 other times. Am I not gonna buy it this time? So,
right.
I think the trick with RE5 and 6 is that they are not as popular as any of the previous games before 4.
Right.
So I think that creates an interesting question. It would be interesting. It would be very interesting to see a breakdown. And this statistic doesn't exist. You'd have to poll it. But, of the people that bought and played RE2 and 3 remake,
right,
how many of them played the original games and how many didn't?
Right.
So for how many people was this? For them, this is RE2 because the original RE2 they didn't play, so it may as well not exist. And I don't mean that as a bad thing or as a gatekeeping thing. That's just how it is. If I've played RE2 before, so I have the context going into RE2 remake.
Yes.
But if you're playing RE2 remake for the first time and that's your first experience with it, that's RE2.
Yes.
There's no reason to consider the older version of the game, and the developer is telling you that because otherwise they wouldn't have remade the game. Now this is the definitive version of RE2 and RE3 and so on. Now, I think part of the appeal for RE2 and 3 remake is people that have played the originals and they want to go back and play an updated version of them.
Right.
I think part of the appeal is people that may not have played any RE games before, but this is the newest one, and it's a very good way to introduce yourself to the franchise.
For sure.
Now, RE5 and 6, that's a much different story because, like I said, RE5, they'd also have to change a lot more things because Capcom got into a little bit of hot water over some certain things at the time that I'm sure would be an even bigger issue now.
Gotcha.
And I think it wouldn't be a bad thing to change those things. But
Yeah.
and RE6 would need a big narrative overhaul. And again, that game, I don't think RE6 is a good game. The franchise is very split over RE6. Some people think it's good. Some people think it's don't. I don't think it's good.
Gotcha.
So I think that if you remake RE6, especially that game, in a weird way, plays the most similarly to the new remakes because you can move and shoot at the same time. It's a more traditional third-person shooter.
Right.
So, in that case, are you basically just making a better version of this game that didn't come out before? So I guess the answer to my question is, I could see Capcom remaking RE5 and 6 if these remakes continue to be as successful as they have been.
Right.
And you have to figure, video game developers are always looking for ways to, once they release a game, they want the rest of the staff still working on something, so that they can retain their staff.
Right.
And these remakes are probably a very good way of doing that.
For sure.
Like I know with RE4 remake, the development started by M2, which is a developer of former Platinum devs, and they were the ones that made RE3 remake. And now the development has been taken over by Capcom Division 1, which is the team that did RE2 remake. So you got to figure, in the midst of releasing more mainline Resident Evil games, these remakes are a really good way of kind of having the rest of the developers cycle through different projects, so that they're always working on something, and Capcom can make more money on it. So I think if Capcom can make money on it, they'll make more remakes.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the same boat. I mean, like, this remake is going to do gangbusters, in my opinion. It's a name that everybody knows, like Resident Evil 4. Like, it's one of the most. I would even go as far as say it's one of the most important games in video gaming.
I'd agree.
So, like, it's going to make some money, especially with the success of 2 and 3. I know 2 did really well. I'm sure 3 did pretty well. Probably not as well as 2 did, but. Yeah, I think this one's probably going to make a lot of money, and a lot of it is name recognition. I mean, like, a lot of this video that I'm writing about is about, like, name recognition. Like, I did my entire senior thesis on just, like, movie remakes and stuff like that, and remakes are made because it's the title. Like, the title is what drives people to the theaters, drives people to buy things. Take a look at The Last of Us. Take a look at Dead Space. Like, those are big names in video game history that, like, they want people to be buying obviously new Resident Evil games, but they want to also buy The Last of Us. They want to buy Dead Space because those games haven't. Well, The Last of Us has come out recently, but Dead Space hasn't been touched in 2008.
Right.
So, well,
shame they never made a third game.
Yeah, they never made a third game. I guess
so much potential that they never tapped into.
Right.
But no, you're right, because and I think, by the way, if you hear in the background, it's we're coming up to date this recording. We're coming up on 4th of July weekend, so there's some fireworks going off around me. So
that's fine.
Enjoy those.
No worries.
But I think it's interesting you mentioned some of the franchises, because I immediately thought of God of War, which God of War 2018 wasn't a remake, but it's definitely a soft reboot of the franchise
For sure.
And I think in many ways, RE7 was a soft reboot of the Resident Evil franchise.
Yep.
Now, there's references to previous games, obviously. But even if you look at the naming of it, it's Resident Evil Biohazard.
Yes.
And for anybody that doesn't know, in Japan, the Resident Evil games are referred to as Biohazard. And they're not they're referred to as Resident Evil in the United States.
Yes.
So a lot of people, again, myself included, saw that when they renamed it Resident Evil Biohazard, subtitle Resident Evil 7.
Yes.
Especially considering where the franchise kind of was at the time. Because you got to remember, before RE7 came out, the last Resident Evil game that came out, I think, would have been Revelations 2, which is a pretty good game.
That's for the 3DS,
but it wasn't
right?
a big game.
Yeah.
And the last mainline game that had come out was RE6, which was divisive at best.
Yes.
That is the most generous description you can give for RE6.
Right.
And, combined with the fact that the movie franchise has been a mess,
Yep.
in a lot of different ways, going into 15, 16, 17, the franchise was not in a super great state.
Right.
And now look at this renaissance of content we're getting.
Yep,
where
for sure.
we've had 2 phenomenal mainline games. We've had 2 really good remakes.
Yep.
And, RE4 remake, I mean, it could only be so much worse than RE4, right? It's
right.
When you're starting with RE4, the game can only be so bad if you're remaking it, so
right.
you have to figure that it's going to be good at minimum.
Right.
So all of a sudden now we're just exploding in good Resident Evil content.
Yeah.
As Silent Hill just continues to wither away.
Rip.
But, I think that you're seeing a lot of that where, God of War has had a soft reboot. I would argue that this is a soft reboot of Resident Evil.
Right.
And, the same can be said for a lot of other, movie franchises. I mean, look at the Halloween movies that have come out recently.
Right.
Star Wars. They literally
recently.
The new Halloween movies, they just ignore every Halloween that came out that wasn't Halloween 2.
Yeah.
They just...
Yep.
Yeah, those movies didn't happen. Don't worry about it. So,
yep.
I think that's really interesting, too. Not only are you seeing all these remasters and remakes and re-releases, but, entire reboots of franchises that are for the next generation. They're...
Right.
When you think about it, they tend to come about 15 to 20 to 25 years after the original iteration came out.
Right.
Which is just in time for a new generation.
Yes.
So, a great example is, you had the Spyro Reignited trilogy that came out.
Yep.
That was made in a lot of ways for people that are, your and my age, because we grew up playing the Spyro games.
Yes.
And it's also perfect for kids now.
Right.
For them to just play it, and now they have an introduction to the Spyro franchise.
Right.
So I think both of those strategies are kind of at play, and I think, it's an interesting trend that, a lot of people would criticize the lack of creativity, and I think that's valid, but, I also think that there is a lot of creative opportunity there when you're trying to retool something that's already been done before.
For sure. You've already mentioned that you're going to be buying this Resident Evil 4 remake. Do you think it's necessary in today's climate, especially when it's so available to purchase like anywhere?
Oh, absolutely not. It's not necessary. I mean, especially, I would say it would be more necessary if it were a remake of, one of the original Silent Hill games, or of Code Veronica, or, Parasite Eve, or, what have you, because there's a very tangible gameplay difference that you're going to find, where the game is a completely different beast, whereas this game will still be very similar to RE4 because it'll still be over the shoulder. It'll just be a lot more fluid, and you'll be able to move and shoot at the same time.
Right.
Which are not... It's not a paradigm shift in the same way that, RE2 and 3 Remake are.
Right.
Necessary? No, I don't think so, especially when, like we mentioned earlier, there are some very good HD re-releases of that game that exist already.
Right. Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same boat as you. Like, even though I've never touched it, although I would probably say the remake will probably be more incentivizing for me to play, because it'll be, quote, like the definitive version to play as. So like, I don't know. I mean, I definitely agree that it's probably not necessary, but it is giving me a reason to go and play it. So, and
I think that's a valid point, and it's, like you mentioned, it is going to be the definitive version of the game, and it's, if you want to extend it out to games that get Game of the Year releases, right? And it's, you look at, in a completely different direction, you look at games like the Civilization series, where those games don't bother playing them until the expansions have been released, because the vanilla game is so woefully different than the version that exists after all the DLCs have been released.
Right.
So I think with these new games coming out, I think it does give, like you said, and you're an example, like, it gives a lot of people a reason to go look at a game that maybe was in their backlog, but they hadn't gotten around to it. Maybe it's a game they always kind of wanted to play, but never got around to it. And now is a really good reason, because now you'll have this shiny new version with a lot of bells and whistles that you'll be able to play.
Right.
You know, especially this game releasing on the PS5, I think the features it'll have on the DualSense controller are going to be really compelling.
For sure. No load times.
Absolutely. And, you know, and you have to figure too, like, you know, you and I grew up in the early, you know, in the era of early 3D polygons where they look really rough.
Yes.
So, you know, you and I have more of a tolerance for that.
Right.
But you have to figure that there might be some people that if they're playing a game for the first time, they don't have the same kind of tolerance for a game that came out on the GameCube.
Right.
You know, their floor for graphical fidelity for a new game to them is just a lot higher.
That's fair.
And that is fair. Well, it's, you know, something that I don't mind. It's something that somebody else might mind, you know, so
right.
In that way, this remake is very compelling to those people too, I would figure.
For sure. Kind of switching gears from Resident Evil, because this video is not necessarily just about Resident Evil, but it's about remakes that are coming out within the next couple years. I'm taking a look at The Last of Us, which is getting remade, and I'm looking at Dead Space 2. Colby, we fucking love Dead Space. It's one of our favorite games of all time.
We stand Dead Space.
We stand Dead Space. Personally, I think I wouldn't say it's one of the most important video games of all time, but I think it's one of the best games that holds up from its era. I've gone back to it recently. I would say maybe like 2 years ago. I played it on PC. I have it on Xbox as well. I can boot up my Xbox and play it. Personally, I think it still looks like a game from I don't know, like 5 years ago. I would say, like I think it holds up that well. And I don't see a reason for a remake of this game at all. But am I going to go buy it? Like that's sort of like the moral quandary that I have right now. Is that like I want to play this game, but like I can literally just boot up this version, and I think it's great. It's one of my favorite games of all time. What's your opinion on this Dead Space remake that's coming out?
I think it's a way for EA to gauge interest in the franchise. And I think reason. That's true of a lot of these remakes. Like EA recently did the Mass Effect Legendary edition or collection, whichever word they used. And again, you have a case where Mass Effect Andromeda came out and it was terrible. Fight me, it was bad.
Yep.
You know, and that comes as someone that I've played the Mass Effect trilogy, the entire trilogy, at least 5 times. I love Mass Effect, and I could not bear to play Andromeda. It was just bad.
Right.
And, you know, obviously, if you asked an executive, would they give you a straight answer on this? Maybe, maybe not. In my non-expert opinion, I think that a lot of these remakes are a way, you know, because and then I'll circle back to Dead Space with this, because they're kind of similar situations that both franchises are in.
Right.
Because in Dead Space, you know, Dead Space 3 was not received very well, both, you know, critically and by the fan base, and they released a DLC that kind of ended the franchise with a little bit of a thud. And, you know, so then they kind of shelved the series, and then you have a similar case with Mass Effect Andromeda, where you have a very popular franchise, new game comes out, it gets panned critically, and, you know, some people have come back around to it on replaying it, but it's still very negatively received, and they shelved all DLC of it. So that was a very clear example of, they kind of saw the response, and they just put the series on ice for a little while. So that's why I bring up Mass Effect, you know, in response to Dead Space, because I think that both franchises are in a very similar spot to each other. And I think with the Mass Effect remaster, you know, that is an example where it's a remaster, not a remake. Right. They did fix a lot of things in Mass Effect 1, and by that I mean they made it playable, because Mass Effect 1 is pretty rough.
Yeah.
It's you know, even running it on a modern PC, I mean, it barely hovers around 30 frames a second. It's not
Right.
great.
Right.
But now it does, and they addressed a couple of things that people didn't like without making big wholesale changes to the game.
Right.
And now we've seen an announcement for a new Mass Effect game. I think that Dead Space, especially because horror games don't always do well.
Right.
Resident Evil 7, a lot of people didn't finish it because it was too scary. So
I'm in that boat.
They wanted to tone some horror elements back going into Village. And
Right.
in a way you can see, well, is Village going to be the same thing with RE4 where it's a great game, but it's a little more actiony, and is it going to have negative ripple effects for the next game?
Right. Dead
So I
Space
think
had
with
the
Dead
same
Space-
had the same problem with 2 and 3.
Exactly,
Right.
and I think that people, it's tough because as a horror fan, I want good horror games, and there's a lot
Right.
of people in the horror community that want good, real horror games, but it's hard to sell that because in a mainstream audience, a lot of people don't want that. They
Right.
and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. That it's if horror isn't your thing, it's hard to push yourself through a very scary game. But I think the Dead Space, first of all, I agree with you that the Dead Space games look great. I mean,
Yep.
they still look fantastic, especially if you play them on PC. Don't even do anything to them. Just literally run them,
Yeah.
at a high modern resolution, with high settings. I mean, they look fantastic.
Right.
Which is very uncommon for a game with a more semi-realistic art style like that one
Right.
has.
From 2008, 12
Yeah,
years
yeah,
ago.
I mean, we're looking at its contemporaries look very dated.
Yeah.
But that game doesn't. And
Yeah.
that's my instinct, is that that EA sort of wants to use this remake to go, okay, again, let's have a developer work on this.
Right.
We'll see what the interest level is. Maybe I don't know if they're planned to do remakes of 2 and 3 after they
Right.
do 1, but I could definitely see if these do well, them reconsidering a new mainline game.
Right. Agreed.
Again, if they do well and if they're received well.
Yeah. That's a good point. I wasn't really
And that's
considering
back to
that.
your, and that, not to cut you off, but that's back to your moral quandary of, do I buy this or not?
Right.
I'm going to buy it because I want to support the franchise.
That's true.
That's sort of what it comes down to for me, is I want to vote with my wallet, and I want to
Right.
say, hey, there is demand for this, and I'm an example of that demand.
That's very true. Yeah, I didn't even consider that maybe they're just trying to gauge interest, because like there hasn't been a game. I don't remember since the last time 3 came out, 2013.
I think it was about 13. That sounds about right.
Yeah, I think I was a senior in high school. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense why they would want to do that. But then we come to the latest announcement from, although I guess it got kind of like announced like a few months ago, but The Last of Us is getting remade. And remade. Well, the first one was just a remaster.
It was a remaster. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the first one was the original game, and then they made the remaster.
Yeah,
But the remaster came out in 2014. So it's been about 8 years since The Last of Us has come out. I would go as far to say. The Last of Us Part 2 came out in 2020. It was announced in 2017, I think 2018. So they were working on it for a long time, and obviously a very divisive game. I don't know how much money it made. I can imagine it did pretty well, but who knows with like refunds and stuff. I think Sony was doing refunds for the game. I don't remember specifically. Yeah, a very divisive game. And everyone was like, hey, The Last of Us Part 1 was like perfect. It should have just ended there. Is that why they're making this one, or do they really truly want to make the definitive version of this game to sort of connect it better with Last of Us Part 2?
I think it's the latter, personally. as the fireworks in my neighborhood just go nuts. I loved The Last of Us 2.
Me too.
You and I spoke about it at length after we both played it. We could fill an entire 3-hour podcast episode about it, but
Yes.
I loved The Last of Us 2. And I think I think the fact that it's divisive is something that they were prepared for with some of the narrative decisions that they made.
Yes.
And that is part of why I like the game, is because they made narrative decisions.
Right.
They didn't sort of just plod along with what they felt people would want. That being said, I think that the Last of Us remaster is definitely to be sort of the definitive version of the game. Especially when you look at just how, you compare, even the the remaster of The Last of Us that came out on the PS4, and you compare it to The Last of Us Part 2, and I mean, they are so, The Last of Us 2 is just so leaps and bounds ahead of the first game, and it's not at all a knock against the first game, because the first game was
gorgeous,
bleeding edge for its time too. It's just that Naughty Dog is one of those developers that they just find a way to squeeze the absolute most amount of performance out of whatever their device they're developing for.
Right.
And I think especially you have to figure that they have a lot of assets in The Last of Us 2 that are shared with The Last of Us in the flashback sequences.
Right.
It's probably not difficult to, remake some of the environments that they would have to remake at this point. And I think it's to bring them, and it's to bring them together. People can play them on the PS5 that way.
Right.
Just like with the PS4, you can play the first game and then you can go right into the second game.
Right.
And, because I think The Last of Us 2, when it comes down to just pure graphical fidelity, is probably the best looking game I've ever played.
It's really good.
And if you're a developer, I mean, I would be hard pressed to not want to put the first game into that new style. I'd be chomping at the bit to do it, because it's like, look at what we can do, because look what we did with the second game. So look what we could do with the first game if we do it again.
For sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The Last of Us remake, I think, is probably going to be the most divisive of all the three that I've talked about, because Dead Space, at least that's been out for or that was out for a long time. It hasn't been. The first game also, I feel like, doesn't get a lot of love. A lot of people really like the second one, and no one talks about the third one. But Dead Space 2, that's always going to be the one that people always talk about and always refer to when talking about Dead Space. But so at least that one has, like, I'm glad that story is being revisited, and maybe they will eventually make Dead Space 2 and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, The Last of Us, like, obviously people were pissed off because of story decisions that Neil Druckmann made in part 2, and it's also not that old of a game, so people are saying, like, hey, this is still playable on PS4, PS5. Like, why am I going to spend $70 and play a game that's basically the same thing? And, like, the upgrade from The Last of Us, I mean, like, when you're looking at games from, I would probably just even refer to The Last of Us as a PS4 game, because, like, obviously it was made to be run on a PS3. Like, they squeezed the ever living shit out of it to out of the PS3 to make it run and look as good as it does. But, like, it basically looks like a mid-tier PS4 game. Especially like the mid years of the PS4. So, like, the graphical, like, updates between the PS4 and PS5, like, that's going to be a lot more different than Resident Evil 4 is going to look like from the remake. Like, it's going to be, like, basically from a GameCube to a PS5. That's, like, several generations in between. The graphics are gonna look amazing. So, like, I'm very interested to see where how much money the Last of Us remake is going to make, because I just don't think a lot of people are going to buy it, because like people are pissed off about it, and I think they have a good reason to, because it's going to be a $70 game that they're basically going to be playing a game that's like free if you have PlayStation Plus. It's going to be basically the same game. But I am very interested in it, because like you were saying about Dead Space, like I want to put my wallet where my mouth is, because like, hey, I love this franchise. I want to see it continue. I don't think this is necessary to gauge interest in The Last of Us, because like they're going to make a part 3 if they want to. Like they're not, like they know The Last of Us is popular. It's one of the most important games of video gaming. So I'm very interested to see where this is going. And like, with this video, I'm talking about like what the purpose of these remakes are, and like why, if we should support them or not. And I'm interested to see where this is going. I mean, The Last of Us, I think it's a great game. I think the original, it still stands up well. Like it's like it's a Naughty Dog game, so like it's gonna play pretty well. Hopefully it's good. Hopefully it's going to be the definitive edition. There's enough of a update to kind of warrant your money. So we'll see.
And I think, excuse me, and I think that is a good point about the Last of Us remake, where, it's probably going to be the most, if you look at the 3 remakes that we've talked about between, Resident Evil, Dead Space, and Last of Us, The Last of Us is going to be the most similar to its original, probably. Right? Because it's, it's an update for all intents and purposes. And, is that worth the full price of a new game? And I have, and from there, you can get into an interesting discussion on, well, how do you determine the worth of a video game? In general, because one of the examples I think of is Octopath Traveler. When that game came out, and I saw so many reviews of people going, oh, this shouldn't be a $60 game. This is a $30 game at best.
Right.
What's the reasoning? Well, it's pixel art.
Right.
Okay. Well, that doesn't mean anything, really. I mean, when it comes down to value of a game.
Right.
But some people would argue, well, no, a game should only be quote unquote full priced if it's, made by a AAA developer and it was expensive to make. And, from there, I would say, well, okay, if you want to get into that discussion, then games should cost $90 to $100 now, because, video games have been costing $60 since the 1980s.
Yeah.
And in the 80s, they were made by a team of 3 to 4 people.
They were more expensive in the 80s. Like some of them were like $90. Like I think Fighter, I think like Super Street Fighter or whatever was like a $90 game, and like that was 80s money. Yeah,
exactly. And that's,
games are as cheap. Games are the cheapest they've ever been right now.
Right. When you boil it down, buying a game now for $60 is a way better value than buying a game, than buying Castlevania for $60. It's an hour and a half long game.
Right.
Because from there you get into the whole thing of, games weren't as long, so they were difficult. And that's how you got your quote unquote value out of them, was that you played them a lot because they were really hard. So you had to play them a lot to get through them.
For sure.
So, I have what I just from talking to different people I've discovered is, I guess, somewhat of a mildly warm take on this. I think a game is worth whatever you feel it's worth as the consumer.
Agreed.
I think if you feel that a game you're buying shouldn't be $60,
don't pay $60.
You're within your right to feel that way, but then don't pay $60 for it. If another person feels that game is worth $60, they're within their right to feel that way. Agreed. Because I think at the end of the day, any piece of entertainment, whether it's games, movies, music, whatever it is, you're getting an experience out of it. That's what you're really paying for, is for the experience of it. Was the experience worth the money you put into it? I think is how you determine the value of that. And I going back to my example of Octopath Traveler, I mean, that game was $60. I put, because some people equate worth to how long the game was or how long they played it. I put 120 hours into that game.
Yep.
And you can beat it in way less than that. I did a lot of grinding and I did all the side stuff and everything. So, I definitely didn't take an efficient route through it, but I would say that's a good return on investment, even by that metric.
Sure.
I mean, but it goes to your point of like, is a remake of a game that I've played before worth $70? I think that depends on who's buying it, and I think whatever your answer is perfectly fine. Because at the end of the day, video games are a luxury item. And that's another thing that a lot of people don't like to hear, and it's fine for them to not like to hear that, but that is what they are. And especially in today's day and age, it's like, do you want to shell out $70 for a game that you've played before? On the flip side, if you haven't played that game before, does it now become worth $70 because you want your first pass through this game to be the good version or the best version? And I think that's very central to remake discussions too, is, who is the audience for them? Is it people, in an example like Dead Space and The Last of Us, you and I have both played both of those games. Versus someone who hasn't played them before. Maybe they heard of The Last of Us 2 and they want to play it, but they had an Xbox One. So now on the PS5, they've never played The Last of Us Part 1, so now this remake is their chance to play a very consistent version of 1 and 2.
One's going to be released on PC as well.
So there you go. And as you know, I prefer to play games on PC.
Yes.
Now what's interesting, I haven't gotten a chance to talk to you about this, is that the PS5 has changed that a little bit because man, that controller is really good.
DualSense is really nice.
It is. I mean, playing Ratchet and Clank on that and having all the different little features of it, and playing Horizon Forbidden West on it, and utilizing all the features on it. I mean, it is literally game changing, pun intended.
Yeah.
So it's funny for me because I would be in the boat a lot of times of I'll wait until that comes out on PC, but now I'm like, well, maybe I will play the console version because
it's really nice.
That controller is really nice, but I think for me personally, I don't know that I would pay $70 for a remake of The Last of Us. I would be curious to see if anything's going to be added. Are they going to include the DLC from the original? I would assume that they are.
They are, I believe.
You got to figure the DLC was $15 on its own. You got to figure they're going to include the little gameplay changes from 1 to 2. Do all those add up to make a game that you might have wanted to only pay $40 for, and now you're willing to, pay $70? For me personally, I have such a massive backlog, as you well know. I would probably wait until it goes on sale. But that's me personally. Like I said, somebody else that this might be their first opportunity to play it, and there's no problem for them to pay $70 for it. I think it's a very case-by-case thing, and I think that's why it's such an interesting, conversation to have, especially when it comes to remakes. Because it's a merging of a lot of different topics, especially when you talk about value. So I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, like, games are incredibly cheap now. Sales, like the Steam Summer Sale, it used to ruin my life.
Started.
Like I remember, like when I first started, I think when I first built a PC, even before I built a PC, I was buying games on Steam because I was like, these are incredibly cheap. Like I got so much shit when my first Steam Summer Sale, and like games are incredibly cheap now. You just gotta wait like not even a few months before a game starts to go on sale, and you'll pay like $45 for it. You'll pay $20 for it. You'll pay $5 for it. Like you can get Doom Eternal right now for $5, I believe, and like that is
insane because
it's a great game.
It's a great game, and what game isn't worth $5?
Exactly. I mean, like a first party Sony game that's probably not going to drop down to $5, but it might get included in, like the PlayStation Plus collection or whatever. Like games are incredibly accessible now. Yes, they are a luxury item, but they are also appealing to a much larger demographic now than they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
Absolutely. It's a much more mainstream form of entertainment now.
Right. And also, just to piggyback off of like talking about remakes and stuff too, like, some people probably haven't touched the game since it came out. Like Resident Evil 4, that came out when, 2005, 2004?
Yeah, 2005.
Yeah, so somebody probably touched Resident Evil 4, hasn't touched a Resident Evil game since, and sees that Resident Evil 5 is coming out and it's going to be on PC or whatever. They're going to be like, hey, I have like a decent gaming PC. I'm going to check out Resident Evil 4. And it's a great way to re-experience the story that you already know and love. Like Dead Space. Yeah, I just played it like 2 years ago, but I'm still fucking buying it because I love the story and I want to be immersed in that world again.
And I'll tell you what, like with to that point, like with RE3 remake especially, one so RE3 remake was a little controversial, is too dramatic of a word, but people had mixed feelings on it because the game was pretty short, and they cut some sequences from the first game,
right?
And that being said, some of the best changes they made to that version are the writing that they did. I mean, the character of Carlos, they completely rewrote and made him actually a good character, whereas before he was kind of just a generic, side character to pop in and out of the story sometimes.
Right.
They have fleshed out Jill's personality more as they did in RE2 remake. So I think that's, to your point, like you can re-experience a story that you're familiar with, but might even be a little bit more than it was before,
sure.
And that can be tricky sometimes because, people have such a strong attachment to the original version that they remember. Right. And I think especially with RE4, so we mentioned way earlier, we mentioned the replayability of RE4. And it is very replayable, as all the Resident Evil games are, because with the earlier games that are they've not branching paths, but there's not one set path that you have to follow, right? And a big part of it is, okay, your first playthrough is going to be very slow. And then the next time you play, it's going to be a lot faster, right? So, like, RE2 Remake, my first run of Claire's campaign was about 12 hours, and now I can beat it in 3 hours.
Right.
And I'm not speedrunning it. I'm not doing any of that. I'm just... It's a much more efficient way of going... Right. I know exactly what I need to do.
Right.
And RE4 is a lot more linear. It doesn't have the same backtracking that the first games do.
Right.
And I have to say, with RE4... it's a long game and it feels long, and I played that game, I think 3 times, I want to say, and I haven't touched it since because I got a little burned out on it because I got to disc 2 and I saw the island and I went, not again. I don't have this in me. So,
same happened with
with
Skyward Sword with you, didn't it?
Skyward Sword, I'm a huge Zelda fan, and I beat Skyward Sword.
Yep.
And I was so excited to be playing a new Zelda game that once I beat the game, I wanted to go back and play Hero Mode.
Yeah.
And I was doing the dive into the first dungeon, and out loud I said, I don't have this in me. I can't do this again.
It's a big game. I actually have it there somewhere. I got the Switch version. I haven't played it yet.
Oh, yeah?
Though. Yeah.
And,
I've heard the Switch version upgraded it a lot, though, so.
Does it? Does it make it a good game now?
I think so, yeah. That's what I heard.
And so another thing, so here's here's something with RE4 that this is a personal taste that hasn't aged quite as well. When I think of RE4, I think of the color brown. I think of brown and gray. I think of those two colors. And
I think of blue because I think the cover is somewhat blue.
Yeah, the cover does have a blue vignette to it.
Yeah.
But I always think disc 1 is brown and disc 2 is gray. That is, and
Nice.
that was one of the biggest things I noticed in the trailer for the new one is I went, wow, look at all those colors that aren't brown and gray.
Nice.
And it's funny because those things are little things, but they can make a big difference on your experience,
Right.
So in some ways that can make a remake a little more viable or a little more compelling, even to someone like me that has played RE4, 3 or 4 times, however many times I've played it.
Right. Well, Colby, we've been talking for almost over an hour. I think over an hour. So
isn't that great?
It's great, and I wish we could be talking a lot more, but we both have lives that we have to get to. But I thank you so much for this conversation because I love talking video games with you because you are a very insightful man and you are a good friend, and we agree on a lot of things. And thank you, Colby, for talking to me. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you, Jimmy, and thank you for having me.
Of course.
And let's talk about video games even more in the future.
I agree. Colby, do you have any social media that you want people to follow you, or are you going to say fuck that?
I don't really use any of them anymore, to be honest.
No, you don't.
I have a SoundCloud that I haven't uploaded music to in several years that, maybe I'll start uploading music to again once I can record music again. Jimmy knows all about that.
Yes.
But that is, if you look up Colby Rich on SoundCloud, I will pop up. I have some acoustic songs on there.
Nice.
You can give those a listen if you feel so inclined. I do have a YouTube channel with exactly one music cover on it. I believe the channel is CCJ Rich.
Yes.
If you want to look that up and see my one cover of Odd One by Sick Puppies.
Nice.
Which, again, maybe we'll have more covers someday, but I'm not promising anything.
Love that for you.
And that being said, if people do want to, find my Twitter or Instagram, they can do CCJ Rich for both, and I'll probably come up.
Nice. Well, thank you, Colby. I appreciate this conversation.
Thanks, Jimmy.